Hi, everybody. Uh, just had a little mic issue, but I'm happy to welcome everybody, all of my fellow pioneers, to tonight's episode of Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History Research and Conversation Program, sponsored by the Roundhouse Foundation. Now, my name is Mariah Rocker, and I am your host for this evening, as per usual. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to spend an hour learning with us. Now, we are, of course, coming to you live on the Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages. If you can't stick around for the entire show, you'll be able to find this and every episode of Black History Quest on our YouTube page. But if you're somehow unfamiliar with Oregon Black Pioneers, despite finding this episode today, let me tell you a little bit about our organization. We are Oregon's only nonprofit dedicated to preserving and promoting the experiences of people of African descent statewide. So we illuminate this seldom told history through a variety of ways, including books that you can purchase on our website, lesson plans that are available for free to download on our website. So if you're an educator, please take note. Exhibits that are showcased throughout the state, and then programs like this one. So this is actually the 8th episode of Black History Quest, OBP's bi-monthly history investigation and conversation program. This program is designed for fellow pioneers like yourselves to geek out together and add to the tapestry of the Black history that we have here in Oregon. It's a chance to take a peek behind the curtain and look at the process of uncovering this history. Now, this is a live program, so make sure to leave your questions in the chat section of the live stream so that we can discuss them on air. Now, without further ado, let's get started with tonight's episode. We are so lucky to have Dr. Ramycia McGhee as our history investigator today. Dr. Ramycia McGhee is a keynote speaker, councilwoman, and educator. She's a Chicago native, a tenured professor of English and literature at Linn-Benton Community College, and the first African-American woman to serve on the Albany City Council. In addition, Dr. McGhee serves on the Oregon Humanities Board of Directors. She's a contributing author to 2 books, Teaching Beautiful, Brilliant Black Girls, love it, and don't forget about the adjuncts. Now, Dr. McGhee is the founder of the Valencia Cooper Second Chance Scholarship Opportunity Award, which solely benefits Black students who are or want to attend a community college in the state of Oregon. So, very much our purview. Now, on top of all that and more, she is a Barbie collector and enjoys traveling, reading, writing, dancing, and spending time with friends, family, and her Shih Tzu Cupcake. Now, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Ramycia McGhee. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for having me, Mariah.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us and for being this episode's history investigator, Dr. McGhee. I am absolutely thrilled to have you join us for Black History Quest. So before I let you, dive into the work that you've been doing, all our Black History Quest investigations begin with a source that kind of sparked an interest for you to dive into. So can you start by telling us the source that you were interested in and what it was that made you want to learn more?
Well, you gave me a newspaper clipping, and I have 2 degrees in journalism. And so for me, I was like, oh, this is excellent. I can then go back to my first love, which is journalism and investigating. I'm a researcher at heart as well. So I was really excited, and just to know more about Mrs. Anderson, who was a trailblazer and a journalist and writer herself. So that really, really piqued my interest.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, representation is such a huge thing. And so being able to look at her story when it goes along the same lines as yours, I can see why it would connect and resonate with you. I think that's part of why our organization wants to tell these stories is to show people that these people existed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a phenomenal story.
Oh, awesome. So what kind of questions did you have about this source? Like, what might it represent?
I first thought, well, who wrote it? What newspaper was it from? What journalist was invested and wanted to take on this? Who was assigned this beat? Because as a journalist, you are assigned different beats newsroom. So I was curious about that, and I was just curious about who would want to tell her story in a way that she was not able to or didn't. So that really kind of started piqued my interest of like, why her and who was responsible for even bringing this story to light?
Oh, yeah, those are great questions. That's awesome. I think we're all interested to learn more and find out what it is you were able to uncover. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to present.
Okay, here we go. All right. So, Mrs. Martha Anderson, Advocacy through Agency and Storytelling, is what this presentation is entitled. And she was a courageous woman. And I'm going to tell you a lot about her story and a lot specifically about the case. So, this was the initial source that was given to me by you all. And it says Portland nurse fighting alone for $250,000 with this kind of blurred out, but you see RCA. And RCA is actually Radio Corporation of America. And so the big question is, why did she sue Radio Corporation of America? And next to it is the sort of the case file, which I had to obtain, which was extremely large to go through. And what we already know about Anderson is that she was a writer, she was a businesswoman, she was a nurse, she was a housekeeper, she was a widower, she was a mother, she was a fighter, and she was an advocate. Over to the right side of the screen, that is Hotel Anderson, which her and her husband owned to house and civil men who had fought in the Civil War, right? So veterans, Black veterans specifically. And it was at first called Hotel Medley, and it was sold to her and her husband, and they bought it and they created their own. It was known for having unsavory people staying there or patronizing it. So when her and her husband obtained it, they sort of cleaned it up and gave it a different image and welcomed Black vets there. She also wrote a book called Black Pioneers of the Northwest from 1800 to 1918. And I was able to rent the book through the Oregon Public Library. And it's a huge book. And it's not that many copies available. Luckily, I was able to obtain the book through interlibrary loan through Albany Public Library. And I also was, if I needed to, I was also able to get it through the Linn-Benton Community College interlibrary loan as well. And she thought it was really important to document the first sort of Black settlers in the Northwest. There was plenty of pictures, plenty of stories, and this was sort of a huge history of documenting how we came to the Northwest at that time. And it's one of the most significant books of Black folks in the Pacific Northwest. So if you have an opportunity, you should definitely read it. I think it's about 250 pages. So let's get into the case itself. Radio Corporation of America is who she sued. And I want to back up just a tad. I want to tell you a little bit more about her. So she was born in October 10th, 1910, and then she died May 24th, 1981. And she was born in Colorado, but she grew up in Idaho. So she has a significant story of just being sort of one of the first Black folks in that area. And so with the Radio Corporation of America, it was a major American electronics company, which was founded in 1919 as Radio Corporation of America. It was initially a patent trust owned by General Electric, which I did not know, and I found that interesting, Westinghouse, AT&T Corporation, and United Fruit Company. So in 1932, RCA became an independent company after the partners were required to divest their ownership as part of the settlements of a government antitrust suit. And actually, I want to even go a little bit deeper with RCA. RCA was actually created after a reorg from Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America, commonly known as American Marconi. In 1897, it was also known as the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company. And it was founded in London, actually, to promote the radio known as sort of the wireless telegraph. As part of the worldwide expansion in 1899, American Marconi was organized as a subsidiary company, holding the rights to use Marconi patents in the US and Cuba. And in 1912, it took over the assets of other other companies that it had acquired, unfortunately became bankrupt in United Wireless Telegraph Company. From that point, it became sort of the dominant force, which was known as, again, Radio Corporation of America in the United States. So when we talk about the case itself, there are some key players in the case, and I'm going to tell you who these folks are. So David Clark is Anderson's great uncle. Cora Clark Adams is Anderson's mom. Emmett R. Bryant is Anderson's first ex-husband. Ethel is Anderson's aunt. Della Clark is Anderson's aunt. Harrison Jackson is one of her attorneys from New York. Mr. McConaughey is the RCA's treasurer and secretary. And then R.W. Nacho is RCA's attorney. And then Howard R. Logergan is Anderson's attorney. So those are the people that we want to keep in mind as we're moving through the details of the case. And I want to tell you a little bit more about David Clark, because he was a really accomplished Black man in Idaho. In fact, he owned a third of Idaho Falls, which was and owned possibly 140 shares of Marconi Wireless Telegraph. When I went to look more into him, there was very little wrote about him. I didn't find much about him at all, which was really sad considering that he owned a third of Idaho Falls. I went to look at some of the Idaho archives. They did like 100-year sort of anniversary of the town. He was not mentioned at all, which is no surprise because it is Idaho and there are not a huge population of African Americans in that state. And so, but I thought they would have had some mention of him, but they did not. So David Clark died and left Cora Clark shares of the stock. Thus, she became sort of the administrator of his estate and was appointed by Idaho court to do that. She then gifted those particular certificates to Anderson and multiple shares on her 16th birthday in 1926. One of those shares being Marconi Wireless Telegraph, now known as, at that time, it went from Marconi to RCA. So in 1929, she contacted RCA to change the certificates that was in her uncle's name to her name, because now she is the owner of this certificate. She's been gifted by her mom these certificates. However, someone from RCA assured her that this change was documented. They said it's fine. She actually asked them, did she need to be reissued these specific documents? They told her, no, don't worry about it. We have record of it. We've changed it. And so she left it alone. She thought that it was fine. She trusted their process. And so she went on about her business. So on the side of your screen, there's a sort of a Radio Corporation of America, just a sample certificate of what it would have looked like of something that she had received from them. So the years of 1929 to 1938, she did nothing with asserting her claim against RCA in reference to the stock certificate. In fact, part of that time in 1929 to 1934, she was working on a ranch in Idaho, and then the Great Depression was occurring. In addition, she suffered a grave loss of her son, who subsequently drowned. And so she was sort of going through a lot. She was working on a ranch. She was sort of rebuilding her life. She was married. You know, she suffered this grave loss. So the certificate was, I guess, the smallest thing on her mind at that time. However, at one point, she did contact RCA to inquire about dividends from the stock and was told they were not issuing dividends at that moment. So in 1942, she recontacted RCA because now she wants to sort of cash in on her certificates, which she should be entitled to, according to her and according to what she was told with her name being now, with the certificates now having her name on it. There was quite a few things that happened as she was trying to obtain these certificates. There was a little bit of family infighting, and then there was quite a few lawyers. So On Thanksgiving Day, 1945, Anderson went to visit Aunt Della, who was in possession of Anderson's personal things, specifically a basket that um, held these specific certificates, stocks, and other important documents germane to Anderson. So Della was aware of this basket and the important papers it contained. However, she was in a sense, and for lack of a better word, sort of jealous of Anderson's life or lifestyle. And she stated, so much so to one of their other family members, that these kids don't have nothing and Martha has everything. So in a sense, she did not feel like Martha was entitled to receive any more than she had already had, and that she was not going to give her back the basket nor the certificates or anything that was included in that basket. So she actually stated that the younger children in the house had burned the certificate, and she wrote a letter stating this for Anderson, and Anderson immediately mailed this letter to RCA right away, and this was around 1945. They confirmed receipts of this letter May 17, 1946, and so they said they had it. RCA confirmed that. She then sent all other correspondence that she could obtain to RCA to Mr. McConaughey, which was the treasurer and secretary at that time, such as the Supreme Court summons that her uncle received from the United Wireless, the will, etc. She sent every correspondence that she had to try to prove, of course, that these were her, the stocks had been, destroyed, and now she needs a new stock reissued. Anderson contacted a variety of lawyers from New York, Seattle, Portland, to look into her situation. And to her luck, or I guess maybe not her luck, there were several people who sort of was interested, such as folks, the New York lawyer who I stated earlier, who went to the United Stock Exchange in New York, and actually witnessed her uncle's name on these specific stocks, these written stocks, but he didn't find her name. Anderson actually ended up hiring an investigator, a private investigator, because one of the things that they stated was that her name was so common. As you recall on one of the previous slides, one of her aunt spelled Clark, Clarke, while her uncle spelled it Clark. And so one of the things was a discrepancy with the last name and the spelling. There was also another woman named Martha Anderson Adams, and Adams was also one of her names, but it wasn't her. So it was this whole debacle about trying to verify and solidify identity, which was an issue, because if you're trying to obtain stocks and you're trying to obtain information and you're trying to win a case, you need everything to align, meaning your name, your identity, your identification, whom you've talked with, all of those things. And so her not being able to do that was a huge problem. While in court, they interviewed her. She gave her deposition. They interviewed her ex-husband. Those are the two depositions that I reviewed. And in that, the lawyers for RCA kept sort of asking her the same exact questions, but in a different way. And I think this was a tactic to wear her out and to try to, trip her up on her answers. But Anderson was a very smart woman, and she was very concise and consistent with her answers and the process in which she had went through in obtaining these specific certificates, or trying to. So there were a couple of things that came out of this case. So on January 30th, 1964, Anderson's attorney sent a letter to RCA's attorney in which she requested certain documentation and information. Those, again, was the things such as the private investigator notes, everything that they had on folks who had owned stock in RCA or Marconi Wireless within the last 20 to 30 years, and some additional documentation. And this is a time where there's no email, there's no faxing, there's no picture taking and sending it over. So everything was done by mail or airmail. And that can take time. That did take time, sometimes months, weeks, even years, especially when we're talking about a case. She was taking on this uh, RCA case from 1945 when she started to recontact them all the way until the 60s. I think 60 or 65. It's like a 20-year ordeal with just trying to prove that you are the owner of a gift that was given to you, and you were assured that it was in your name. So in May 27, 1964, RCA's attorney sent the letter to Judge Gus J. Solomon in Portland, stating, as we have several times advised Mrs. Anderson, her previous counsel, and the court, RCA has no records of Wireless Liquidating Company. So then now there's another change in name, although these are the same people, Marconi Wireless, Wireless Liquidating Company, and RCA. These are all subsidiary companies within this larger company. So July 15, 1964, Anderson filed an appeal in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. January 7th, 1965, RCA's lawyer sent another letter to the court clerk in the U.S. District Court of Oregon stating they had been advised by the appeals court in 9th District that Anderson had received a judgment of dismissal, and they needed a copy of this in an effort to dismiss the appeal and conclude this matter. And so they used something called Rule 26 as a judgment to dismiss her case. And Rule 26 is really a procedural mechanism to dismiss the case because of the real party in interest has not been impacted. So basically stating that the real party, being her uncle, Mr. Clark, was not impacted. One, he was deceased, and two, he was the real and rightful owner of the stock. And she could not prove that she was the owner of this specific stock because, again, she had no record. She had nothing to solidify her ownership. And so they used time. They used this specific rule to dismiss her case in all of these years. Not to mention this woman spent so much money in hiring different lawyers, paying for expenses for mail and documents over the course of 20 years. And by this time, when I read her deposition, she was around 50 years old. And so give or take, going on that long, I mean, she was in her 70s probably when they dismissed the case. And as you're getting older, things are changing. You're getting tired. She couldn't remember certain things when they were questioning her, even at her age of 50, and not because she was incoherent. It's just because there was a lot of time that had lacked. There were major events that happened in the United States, the Great Depression being one of them. Not to mention she was a rancher. She was working in Seattle. She was traveling back and forth between Idaho, Seattle, and Portland. Okay. So further research, and I just want to direct your screen. On the right side of your screen is Martha Anderson in her older age, and then on the other side is the Black Pioneers Northwest recorded in book, and so her book was published in the paper, and they talked about it. So for further research, I would want to investigate Anderson as a writer, since that's what I am, and I wasn't able to really investigate that because I was so engrossed in the case. Additional examples of Oregon, of Black entrepreneurship and generational wealth, because she was an entrepreneur, and there was generational wealth that was generating from her uncle's owning a third of Idaho Falls to that falling to her mother. It was just it would be good to look at some other examples in Oregon that sort of reflect that. So the significance. One of the things that was really significant about this case is that there was really no infrastructure in place to assist her in her fight against RCA. And has that changed when we think about the legal system, when we think about how Black folks are represented and who they're represented by, and is their best interest at hand? And one of the things, there needs to be a rise in Black legal aid services in Oregon in an effort to help in these kinds of cases and others. I mean, this woman was, time and age was not on her side. And as she was getting older, it was getting harder and harder to fight against this huge corporation. This is one woman, this is one Black woman, taking on this huge corporation that's taken her through a million hoops, all to tell her no at the end of the day. There needs to be an increase of Black attorneys and Black judges in the state of Oregon that may result in possible favorable verdicts, or at least verdicts that are understandable, verdicts that make a lot more sense. And then the importance of documentation and self-determination for Black folks to accumulate wealth. One of the things as a journalist I have always lived by is that never trust anyone's information but your own. Investigate, verify, investigate, and cross-reference are some of the things that you must do. And unfortunately, she took the word of a secretary and attorney for RCA who assured her that her name had been, well, he didn't do it, but someone else assured her name had been changed. The name had been changed and it was now her certificate. They also assured her that they didn't need to reissue anything. So just really, really following up as much as possible, getting a lot of things in writing versus taking someone else's word for it. And some of the credits I like to give for this is the Seattle Archives. Crystal was amazing. I had to look through 3 case files, and these were primary documents, so it's really hard to read some of these things. But looking through a court, multiple depositions, multiple case files, it was really not only expensive, but it was also just, I felt like I was drowning sort of in paperwork for a while. I kind of felt like an attorney, which I wasn't mad about, but I have a newfound love for them in what they do. Dr. Richard McGregory, who really helped me to sort of craft my research question and think about sort of the significance and how to move this sort of information forward. Dr. Colleen Taylor for her unwavering support. The Albany Public Library for making sure that I got the book. The Linn-Benton Community College Library to also make sure I got the book, and then Judge Faye Stetswaters, who was able to kind of break down some of the legal jargon that was in the case file that I was not understanding clearly, but was able to break it down in layman's terms for me. And that is all that I have.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing and kind of giving us, more information about Martha and her story and the experience that she had in particular trying to fight for her rights, as you so aptly talked about. Just for a little bit of background, because this was, our part of the goal of this organization, of this presentation, of this program, is to dive deeper into things that we have like a tiny bit of knowledge about, but don't have very much knowledge about at all. So we offered up at the beginning of this process. So this is, again, a peek behind the curtain of the process of even just this program. We offered up that scan of the newspaper because it was something that we had in our files, but had truly no idea what the story was. Like, we knew who Martha Anderson was. We didn't really have any information about who she was suing or anything like that. And so you were able to through extensive research, like you just said, going through these, really difficult to process pieces of information, you were able to fully lay out what it was that, that this article was about. You provided so much more information beyond what was mentioned in the article, because it really didn't give a clear understanding of what her experience was. So just great job. Thank you for, figuring that out and being willing to share that with us today. We really appreciate it. But so, yeah, thank you.
Oh, of course.
It
was my pleasure.
It is so interesting to look at, how she just made a few simple mistakes. I mean, I don't even know if you should necessarily put it on her, but like you said, not confirming that information was passed along, letting it lapse for time while she was busy. It's just so interesting how these small things can result in her losing. How much was it that she would have been, that she should have
Well,
received?
they didn't even give what she would have received in the case file.
Really?
Yeah, which is
Really?
really, yeah, which I found was really interesting as well.
That's
So much
interesting.
so that I went back and contacted the Seattle archives to make sure I downloaded all what they had. And I
Really?
did. I
Yeah,
did. I
and there
had
wasn't anything
everything.
about that.
And no,
Interesting.
because I was like, what do they mean dismiss? Dismiss what? Like what happened? What do you mean dismissed it on what grounds? And that's when
Yeah.
I had to lean into Judge Faye Waters to really understand what that meant, Rule
Mm.
26. And if you're not familiar with that kind of jargon, legal jargon, you know, you don't
Oh,
know.
yeah.
And so, yeah, but
Yeah.
they didn't give a specific amount, which lets me know that it must have been significant because
That,
they told
that
you
is that's a great point.
undisclosed
Um,
amount.
sure. Yeah, even just that, I love how, when you're talking about the credits, you really demonstrated the fact that it's even, we're paying you to do this research, but it takes a village to really uncover these stories. You might be able to pull on the thread, but you're gonna need someone to help, you know, continue to pull that thread. And so it's interesting how you had to work with different parties to kind of get that information. But anyways, all that to say, very glad that we were able to learn some information about that today. But I did want to ask a couple, thoughts and questions. Actually, one of the first things that comes to mind is you did mention that you were interested in how her story ended up into the paper in the first place. And I'm curious, because you didn't really quite mention it, but were you able to find out like what newspaper it was in? Because we didn't know, or why it ended up in the paper in the first place.
No, because I went
Okay.
right into the case. I delved
Oh,
directly
fair.
into the case. At first, I delved into her a little bit because I did want to know who she was. And
Sure.
because the case sort of took on a life of its own in my research, I didn't really get an opportunity to investigate that actual piece of um, source that you gave me, which I guess I could do that for further research as well to find out who actually printed this and who was the reporter on the beat, because it doesn't really say. Um,
Sure.
and it's a sort of a blurb. And I was, like, why even bring it up if you don't have the source of where that had come from? Like why wouldn't it be there somewhere on the paper?
Yeah, it's interesting, and that's you bring up a great struggle that we deal with, doing this work. Both our history investigators like yourself, or us within the organization, is that it can be so difficult to trace these stories because we might just have one little glimpse, to dive into. And though you were able to give us a lot of information about this case, and it really demonstrates how much, even though legalese is difficult, how much all these, really, it's court cases often, for the history that we're talking about too. It's typically court cases that we're able to track what's going on through. And it's so interesting how important that is to, keeping track of these stories, and maintaining them. I guess it's interesting how those are the sorts of sources that we have to lean on,
Mhm.
to find more information, because there often aren't, like, even if there was this one newspaper article, there wasn't very much to go along with it. So
No,
yeah.
no. In fact, when I first got the initial source, I might have Googled a little bit about her, and it wasn't much about her. I mean, she does have a little something called like a little library that's up in Burns, Oregon, which is where her and her husband lived for a very long time. Her husband, Walter Anderson, and his brother was one of the first Black ranchers in Burns, Oregon, which is Eastern Oregon. And
Yeah.
so they finally honored her, I want to say in 2020 or 2021, something like that,
Oh.
with one of those little libraries outside. And the
Oh.
display about her. And it took all those years. It took all those. And
Mm.
Harney County is where they lived while they were in Burns. Um,
Yeah.
but I think when I initially got it, I had to, because there was nothing even about the case file itself. So I had to call. I think I found something, and I ended up calling the Oregon Circuit Court and giving them a case number. How I got the case number, Mariah, I can't remember, because I was I was so into it for a long time, then I had to take a break. Then I got
Mm,
back into it, and then I had to take a break. Then I got back into it and got done with it. But I remember calling, and it was like 4:50, and someone picked up the phone, and I was able to give them the case number. And then she said, "Hey, that's in the Seattle archives." I called the Seattle archives. They had some sort of busy signal that it just wouldn't pick up. And that
oh,
was odd. And I thought, oh my God, this is an invalid number. So then I
mm,
emailed. Well, then it took them a long time to get back with me about the email.
mm,
And so it was kind of like running after this case, running after these case
sure.
files. So which that didn't leave a lot of opportunity to actually investigate the initial source.
Totally. And that's a great point about historical research too, is that when you really try to drill down on something, if you're lucky enough to find a lot of information, it can be overwhelming to even go through that, let alone trying to follow other trails that you're interested in. So it makes sense that you have additional things that you'd like to look into if you had more time. But I also was curious in terms of your findings, did they like meet your expectations or were they different? What were you yeah, how did you feel?
Yeah, I don't know if I had any expectations.
Sure.
I guess maybe one thing I did expect to find is I thought she would win the case. As I was going through the case, I was like, "Oh yeah, she got this. It's gonna happen for her. She's been persevering. Like she's been on it. Like she's
Mm,
gonna win this case." So I was really let down that she didn't. I was
mm.
really sad about that. And I felt defeated for her because
Sure.
reading that as I was reading the case files and the depositions, I felt like I was watching a movie because every time I was reading it and I had so many notes, I had to create this very long timeline because it was a lot of dates,
Mm,
especially with deposition and court appearances. There were so many dates. And
oh,
so
sure.
trying to draw a timeline was also very difficult. So expectations, I just expected her to win. So that not happening for
Mm,
her after all of those years was really disappointing.
that's so fair. That totally makes sense. Um, was there anything that you sorry, I kind of actually lost the question that I had.
That's okay.
No, but there's a lot of different things that come to mind when I think about the story. The fact that it traversed such a long period of time and yet nothing was able to come from it. There are so many different questions that it's difficult for me to pinpoint what it is that I want to talk about. But I will say this isn't really a question, but it is interesting. In terms of like I learned a lot about what her experience was like in this court case through your presentation, but I also learned some pieces of history that I wasn't familiar with. As I call myself a Pacific Northwest girl. I was originally born and lived for a little while in Idaho, and I
Oh,
didn't. I talk about Martha Anderson, through my work at Oregon Black Pioneers, but I wasn't aware of her connection to Idaho, of the fact that there was a black man that owned, a third of Idaho Falls. Like, you're blowing my mind here, and it's so interesting because it demonstrates how there are so many pieces to this story, and yeah, it's really difficult to follow along and get them all. But at the very least, I'm very intrigued by what you were able to uncover.
I
And
almost
yeah,
went down a rabbit hole with the uncle. I have to be honest because
yeah,
that's like, let me just research, Mr. Clark to see if they had any. That's why that was another sort of disappointment that he wasn't mentioned at all, having
Mm,
owned a third of a town
yeah,
as a black man in Idaho. That was disappointing, but typical to leave us out of
yeah.
stories. So that,
Mm.
unfortunately.
Yeah, that's something that we're overcoming, that this work is trying to overcome. The fact that these stories have, typically been left out, just like you're describing. And so that's why nobody knew what happened with Martha Anderson's story related to this civil suit. So, yeah, really appreciate that you were able to uncover more about that. And you already really answered. I was going to ask where your next research directions would be, but there's so many different ways, talking about her as a writer, talking about her family, and things like that. Is there anything else that you were interested in that had piqued your interest while you're doing the
Yeah.
research?
Um, Yeah, her work with the Seattle radio was really something I would like to uncover a little bit more. She was a writer for them, um,
Oh,
right? had a Black woman become a writer for Seattle sort of public radio and in the 30s and the 40s.
Yeah.
Right. And so I would have just really wanted to know more about her as a writer. I mean, I know that she wanted to document Black folks coming here, and we've always been here in a sense. And so I know that that was very important to have our story out there. But she was sort of a lone wolf in that, right? Like there weren't a lot of Black people publishing books about our existence here in the Pacific Northwest. So that was really intriguing. So I would want to learn more
True.
about her. And I would want to learn more about her upbringing, what inspired her to become a writer. Because she was a rancher too, which was also odd. Like those are very stark, different professions. One is a trade and one is, more of a profession, which is the writing piece. And I would really like to know what inspired her. I mean, like I said, she had an interesting upbringing to be born in Colorado and then to be and to grow up in Idaho and to witness sort of the things that her grandfather or her great uncle was doing. So I would really want to know what inspired her to be a writer and how she sort of obtained those jobs, those employment positions that really helped, I think, to add a lot of richness and texture to Seattle Public Radio.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I love that she's a figure with so many different aspects to her. It's really incredible to see something like that, and I appreciate you sharing what you were able to uncover with us today. So, I definitely have to ask the question that I ask everyone in our, all of our Black History investigators, which is, how has what you uncovered changed our understanding of history? So that could be locally, that could just be about her. However you want to frame it, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I tried to answer that with a little bit of notes, so let me just look here.
Sure.
I think that it just shows that, she's a journalist, she's a trailblazer, she's a storyteller. She fought into the bitter end till there was nothing else to fight for. She, she held that, she did that. I think it just shows again how the legal system moves very slowly, and that is both good and bad. Unfortunately for her, it was bad. And I think that it shows, it sort of reaffirms that strong Black woman trope, if you will, because she had lost her son and she didn't really have a time to grieve. She was back working and on the ranch, running back and forth, fighting this case, also getting a divorce, right? And so she, even though that strong Black woman trope is, both good and bad, she really exemplifies what that looks like, and especially at a time like that. So I think for me, leaning into her in that space and in that way was really significant. And so it just continuously shows us that, you got to keep the fight going, I guess. Even stand if you can't stand no more, continue to stand, kind of thing. And I think as we think about history, especially history can repeat itself. I would really love to see what her descendants have now. What happened with Hotel Anderson?
Right. Yeah.
What happened?
That's a great question.
Part 2, part 3, right? What happened to Hotel Anderson? What did her descendants receive? Did they receive nothing? And again, it just shows how, again, you can be, I just feel like she was robbed out of her inheritance. And that's really sad because, you think you're doing the right thing. Your uncle's leaving you things. Your mother's giving it to you because she couldn't do anything with it. You're one of the, quote, smarter ones in the family. They see you doing great things and they were investing in you. And to know that you were robbed out of your inheritance because someone felt that it was okay to do that. And not only do that, but lie to you about things regarding that. And she knew in her heart of hearts that she was entitled to that. And again, like I said, I believe it was a significant amount, but let's keep it real. It probably wouldn't have put a dent in their pocketbook if they had paid her.
Sure. Absolutely.
And at some point, I think they actually filed bankruptcy. So I think that they was, again, starving, okay, feeling away. And they just said that this is one tiny woman taking on all of us. And we have all the lawyers, and we have all the legal aids, and we have all the terms, and we have all the resources and time and money. And she doesn't. And she did, but it was costing her a whole lot, much more than it was costing them.
Absolutely.
So I think we just really have to be careful about trusting folks. It's a cautionary tale. And I'm sure that it is quite a few stories like that, unfortunately, here in the US and abroad.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, you mentioned it yourself in your presentation, the fact that we need more people support, like that there needs to be more infrastructure in place to help the people that don't have a team of lawyers to back them up in situations like this. So I definitely see where you're coming from there. And I think that this is both, you're absolutely right about this being a cautionary tale, but also a great example of her, persevering through and trying her best to claim what was rightfully hers. I mean, you have to give mad respect to her for at least trying, right? Like,
yeah, I think at one point in her deposition, she said, if I had it, I wouldn't need nobody. That's exactly what she said. If I had the documentation, I wouldn't need nobody. And I was like, yeah, she wouldn't have. And it just shows, also too, like, us as Black people in community, we really have to have our affairs in order, wills, living wills, insurance policies. We got to have so much documentation, and we have to make sure that we triple check, cross check, and make sure our affairs in order when we leave this earth, because you don't want situations like this happening, or you don't want situations like the things that happened between her and her aunt and that infighting. You want things to be laid out very clear and concise so that nothing can be disputed.
True. Yeah. If he had, for example, had that in his will, it would probably be a lot easier they would know, because they knew that he owned the shares. And if he had that in his will, there you go. So that's, just a lesson learned for us. And it's funny that comes up, because I'm pretty sure August is like make a will month. So just as a
there it is,
reminding everybody, yeah, like if you didn't, at the very least, hopefully you'll learn that you need to have your affairs in order in that sense, after listening to Martha's, unfortunate story in the sense that she wasn't able to win, but you still gotta love that she attempted to persevere. But yeah, so, this was great. Thank you so much for letting me pick your brain and talk about what this experience was like. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we let folks go?
Yeah, I just think that when you go to get case files, be prepared to spend, because they are expensive. And they do come quite, in a load. And there were times that the case files were scanned upside down. So having to turn my laptop upside down to read, that was a little, so I would definitely say, and then probably have a law library or a law book next to you, or be in a law library, or have someone who is in some sort of law enforcement or legal or around, so that you can ask some questions, because it is a lot of terminology in there that can really trip you up. And at first I was like, oh my God, this case is so convoluted. Just get me to the point. Because I felt like I was reading so much and I had all these timelines. And finally I was like, I just need to make a new fresh clean sheet with all the different dates, because it was so many. And so I think, and being patient, knowing that you could be muddling over case files for months.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You were working on this for, quite some time, and there's a lot of information that can be difficult to parse through, especially for case files. So that makes sense that would take so long. Thank you for giving some actual helpful tips for anybody that's interested in doing this sort of work. Just for themselves, or if they're interested in working with us, reach out. But yeah, good idea. That's great. Well, it has been absolutely wonderful to learn from you and talk to you, Dr. McGhee. This is fantastic. We really appreciate you for being our history investigator this time and for sharing your research with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Had a great time.
Yeah. Yay. Glad to hear it. We were glad to have you. Awesome. Well, till next time when we do the part 2 or 3.
Oh, Lord. You might see me back in a year or two. We'll see.
I love it. Thank you so much. Well, bye, Dr. McGhee. So thank you so much, everybody. That'll do it for this episode of Black History Quest. As always, we want to thank Roundhouse Foundation in Sisters, Oregon for sponsoring this show. It is thanks to the funds that they're able to give us that we pass along to our history investigators so that Dr. McGhee didn't actually have to necessarily pay for those case files on their own. We'll help do that if you're ever doing research for us in this capacity. Learn more about them and the projects that they support at the roundhousefoundation.org or roundhousefoundation.org. And so just as a reminder, Oregon Black Pioneers does depend on the support of ordinary people who believe in sharing the stories of Oregon's Black history. So if that's you and you enjoyed this show and would like to support it and others like it, please consider a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers through our website. And then if you have questions about this episode or would like to become a history investigator yourself, which I see there might be someone interested in the chat, and I'm glad to see it. But if you are interested, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org, and we would love to work with you to uncover more about Oregon's Black history. Now, stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest in September, where, as always, we'll try to answer the question, how can one source change history? Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.